Hello, I'm Susanna Reese from Stop Pests and Housing. Welcome to today's webinar, Hoarding, Housing, and Pests, a New Approach. This webinar is brought to you by Stop Pests and Housing. We're housed here at Cornell University's Northeastern IPM Center. We provide integrated pest management resources and training and consulting services to public housing and project-based Section 8 housing. We do this with an interagency grant through HUD's Office of Healthy Homes and Lead Hazard Control and the USDA's National Institute of Food and Agriculture. Today we're going to hear about how the Boston Housing Authority collaborated with the Boston University School of Social Work to address a problem many of you who work in housing are probably pretty familiar with: how to address hoarding and clutter among residents to promote a healthy, pest-free home. An integrated pest management approach to pest control really relies heavily on eliminating harborage for pests. That means eliminating the hiding spots, but this can be extremely difficult in cases where there's a lot of clutter and hoarding. Today we're going to learn how the Boston Housing Authority addressed this issue, and we hope that you can take back some of what you learned to your own housing site. If you have any questions or need further resources and other training materials, visit stoppests.org and email us at stoppests@cornell.edu if you have questions after this webinar. Our speakers today are Dr. Jordana Muroff. She has a PhD in social work and psychology from the University of Michigan, Ann Arbor. She's currently an associate professor at the Boston University School of Social Work, and she's a licensed independent clinical social worker. Much of her research and publications have focused on cognitive behavior therapy for hoarding disorder. She's an author of numerous publications, journal articles, and guides, and she's a great resource. John Kane is a senior program coordinator for the Boston Housing Authority and has worked with the BHA for the past 12 years. His work emphasizes resident engagement. He engages numerous healthy housing research collaborations, focuses on developing better understanding of the built environment and resident health programs. He uses his knowledge to improve the health and living conditions of the residents of the Boston Housing Authority. Jesse Edsel-Vetter is a hoarding intervention coordinator for the Metropolitan Boston Housing Partnership. In 2006, he oversaw the establishment of the Metropolitan Boston Housing Partnership Sanitation Initiative, Hoarding and Sanitation Initiative. It's an intensive case management approach to hoarding intervention. Over the past 4 years, the Metropolitan Boston Housing Partnership has expanded their case management program to include training for housing providers, first responders, and nonprofit staff, and others throughout the United States. I'm looking forward to hearing what our speakers have to say. Thank you so much for joining us today, and special thanks to our presenters for sharing their knowledge. Thank you.
Okay, so this is John Kane. I'm with the Boston Housing Authority. And want to say thank you to start to Cornell University, Northeast IPM Center for their support for doing this work and for creating this opportunity to do this webinar with you all today. The Boston Housing Authority has been working on this issue of integrated pest management for a number of years, and we have had some successes with it, but we continue to face some challenges. One of those places where we have faced challenges are in units that have a lot of clutter or have people with hoarding. And so we undertook this project in collaboration with some of our partners a few years ago to get a better understanding of the prevalence of the issue of hoarding and clutter, as well as some tools that we can use to assess it, that we can have better consistency and a better way for us to manage this issue. And that's what brings us to this webinar today.
Hi, this is Jordana Muroff, and I'm delighted to be here and appreciate this opportunity to share some of the approaches that we have developed and have been working on related to hoarding as well as pest management. I wanted to also highlight we are just several folks as part of a much larger team of folks as well, and so wanted to acknowledge not only wanted to acknowledge our team members as well. So Dr. Campbell at the Boston University School of Public Health, Dr. Christina Radiotis at University of Nebraska, Omaha, on her way to Portland right now, and a number of students and trainees as well. Most of them have gone on to graduate. You can see in public health and in social work as well. And Lori Luce at BHA and members of the community for health promotion, the clients who are willing to engage with us, over time the residents themselves, and again, this was funded by the SBA. and through Cornell. So thanks so much for having us today. So we're going to get started, and actually, Jesse's going to start.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. We've got a lot to cover, so we're going to jump in by talking about how to identify and define hoarding. Primarily for housing providers, there are a few boxes you want to check off in your mind as you're trying to assess a hoarding or clutter situation. The first one is there the acquisition of and failure to discard a large volume of possessions? So for many of us, this looks like residents where you're not able to access the bedrooms or a large number of possessions, bathrooms where you're not able to take a shower or access the toilet perhaps because of those things. The next box is, does the clutter make it difficult to use the room for their intended purpose? And then finally, is there distress or impairment in functioning caused by the clutter? And so some residents with distress or impairment in functioning may not recognize that, but we as professionals certainly have some level of concern about their health and safety. And then we may see impairment in functioning such as the inability to find medications to walk safely through their homes. Another example could be perhaps difficulty preparing food in their kitchens because of the volume of clutter. So as you're assessing some of the photos we're going to be moving forward, looking at and doing your work in the community, those are the things you want to start with when you're doing that assessment process. So the photo here that we have is a one-bedroom apartment that is both hoarding and squalor. The hoarding level is quite severe in this home, and so the photo is dark. You can see in the foreground styrofoam food containers, shopping bags, trash and other debris. And this particular tile in this home ranges about 5 or 5.5 feet high. And so this is an instance of sanitation and squalor in addition to hoarding. So going back to those first two poll photos, the one that you see here with the chair in the middle of the room, this is simply there we go, with the bed here. This is hoarding and squalor. The mattress is heavily squalid. The floor also is quite sticky in this home. And then we've got a low level of clutter and in the rest of the room there. You can see the boxes and piles here, and the piles on the side of the screen here as well that are all filled with various kinds of possessions. This photo is one that is, again, hoarding only. You see the very large piles and stacks of papers, videotapes, and so forth on both sides of this chair. It's very difficult to access the chair because of the volume of clutter. But in this home, there is no squalor issue, there's no infestation concern either. This is the kitchen photo that I mentioned, and you can see here that there's, again, a large volume of clutter blocking this back door. It's a mild to moderate hoarding situation, and this is another example where there is only hoarding and no squalor. All right, so let's turn our attention to demographics and prevalence. What we know through our research colleagues is that saving actually begins in childhood, though we may think of it as a problem that happens with adults. Generally speaking, it's 12 to 13 years of age, folks start to accumulate possessions, and over time, those possessions build. Hoarding has a chronic and worsening course, and what that means is that until someone either develops insight into the hoarding program or problem, or someone steps in to say you need some assistance, you have a problem, no one's going to get treatment or get assistance. So average age for folks, one of my colleagues who treat this problem clinically in the research studies is 50 years of age. Marital status, people tend to be single. There are high divorce rates, so people do marry. Education ranges widely. One of the things that we know is that there is a family history of hoarding, and so that's why sometimes you will see siblings who share a problem with hoarding, parents and children share a problem. Some of that may also be learned behavior. There's still a lot we don't know about that. And then for my colleagues who are lucky enough to do clinical work, they don't often see squalid conditions. About a third of the people we see in our program at NBHP, however, do have squalor in addition to their hoarding problem. One of the things that I find interesting is 3 to 5% of the population in the United States has a hoarding problem. It's about 15 million people. So just to give you some comparison, about 5.4 million people have Alzheimer's in the United States. This is a much bigger rate, as you can see, than the Alzheimer's rate. It's much bigger, actually, it's twice the domestic violence rate. And so we have issues that are pretty significant public health concerns in this country, and hoarding is more than all of those, and yet we don't have the response system that we need to assist people in the community, both in housing and in a variety of other domains as well. So in terms of thinking about hoarding with public health, there are a few key areas that we should be concerned with. The first and foremost, especially for those of us who are housing providers, is the risk of fire. Certainly the increased volume of flammable materials such as paper and clothing can cause fire to spread much more rapidly than it would in unhoarded homes. Concerns around blocked egress, both in terms of the residents exiting the unit in cases of emergency, but also for our colleagues who are first responders going in to respond to those emergencies. Lots of concerns about trip hazards with residents and others falling in the home due to some of the piles. Structural issues, such as, in Boston we have a number of older homes, and so when we start thinking about those older homes with heavy volumes of books and paper and other things that can really put weight on the structure, that can be a huge issue as well. So eviction risks are a large concern, in addition to the community costs, cleanouts costing tens of thousands of dollars, and there's not a lot of data about how effective that is as a strategy. And then last but not least, the pest infestation that we're here to talk about today.
So the CDC has basically, identified that integrated pest management is necessary to reduce the number of pests that threaten health and property and reduce human exposures to harmful pesticides. So obviously another aspect of hoarding and a potential public health risk has to do with pest management, which of course is not surprising to many of you. So we were specifically compelled by public housing and to be thinking about doing this work, this collaboration with Boston Housing Authority and looking at public housing specifically because hoarding, poor sanitation, and or clutter, and those distinctions are important as we continue to talk today, are, of course, potential barriers to successful implementation of IPM, and have been identified by folks as challenges of IPM, on the ground and, in other conversation as well. We're in the Boston area, so obviously this is a very urban area, and our public housing is much more high density kind of living situation generally, but then so maybe even more so given our geographic location as well. Public housing is an interesting site from the standpoint of having annual inspections, so those LUIs become, or those living unit inspection forms become an opportunity to basically be able to track and understand, look at data over time as well. And of course, we have a big concern around tenancy preservation because folks in public housing may have been homeless before or are a step away, so to speak, from being homeless again. And we know when folks have lost vouchers, that they potentially may not get them again at all. The other thing is that a lot of our research, clinical research related to hoarding has done with pretty homogeneous groups of folks. It's, the folks who seek treatment, so essentially kind of white, middle-class females who are seeking treatment. And, we know there's many more people with this problem who don't seek treatment for many, many reasons. And so public housing, allows us to look at hoarding amongst a much more diverse population and us to think about how to address it more broadly than from a mental health perspective. And what we know as mental health providers is that mental health treatment is cannot be the kind of end-all be-all to addressing hoarding. We need to break out of our silos and work much more broadly with other human service personnel and so forth together to address this mental health and public health problem. So we're going to summarize a bit of the, I'm going to summarize a bit of the research study today that had two phases. One was to characterize the prevalence of hoarding behavior in DHA housing, to look at the association between clutter and or poor sanitation and pest control visits. And then in our second phase one, which we typically call phase two, is to look at a small pilot treatment or intervention with residents to reduce hoarding behavior. And we've also worked on developing and starting to deliver a hoarding intervention training book with DHA staff, and of course today with you all as well. So we're going to look at our first phase one together here. And so basically, while DHA serves many, many, many more housing developments, we focused in on four specific ones, two of which were elderly and two were family-based, to develop a big database in order to start answering some of our questions about prevalence and characterizing hoarding in public housing. So basically over about a 2-year period, we started looking at some of the living unit inspection forms and Pest forms. And you have, I believe, in your possession a living unit inspection form. You can't really see it well on the screen here. That's okay. It's a pretty busy form. But I basically highlighted there the section that's kind of focused more on health and safety so that you can see. And one of the things that you might notice looking at your form is that there's actually no box for clutter when we first started this project. And so you see that there's, fire exits, blocks, and flammable materials and other hazards and so forth, but no box for clutter. And so we couldn't just kind of count up all the checkoff boxes for clutter because it didn't exist. And what you might also notice is that the box for the comment section is very small. And so speaking with our managers, we came to find that a lot of folks basically wrote all their comments all over the form. And so we wound up engaging in a coding scheme to basically code the content of that comment box. And I'll describe that coding scheme in a moment. But our team looked at 3,260 living unit inspection forms and extracted the specific data, and also went through that coding scheme. And then also looked at 5,516 Pest forms and used different coding as well. Now, unfortunately, each company kind of uses its own Pest form. And so certain companies had certain indications that other companies' forms did not. But we did code for Pest type. The Pest mentioned, in other words, was whether they're scheduled visits. The type of activity was the actual evidence of activity. Some forms did have an indication of clutter, others did not. Other indications were preparations for treatment or actual pest treatment, or that folks refused entry. And if there was a reason, that was noted, but often it just said refused entry. And we wondered about those who, as a possible indicator for someone who is hoarding who did not want someone in their home, because we often know that happens as well. So in our coding, we actually developed two separate coding schemes. One was related to clutter, looking at, of course, because excessive clutter could be an indicator of hoarding, but any kind of clutter could affect pest control. So you see here the indications of no clutter, some clutter, being one mention of clutter through any of the pest forms or LUIs, but it had no strong qualifier. In other words, that if there's a mention of clutter in a specific area, or that it wasn't very or excessive clutter, that's what went into that category. Excessive was that there was at least two or more mentions of clutter, or one mention with a strong qualifier, so for example, very or excessive type of clutter. And then we did the same with poor sanitation. So again, any poor sanitation could affect pest control. So we did a similar coding scheme using the comment boxes or other indicators for no sanitation, some sanitation, or excessive sanitation, with similar qualifiers for each that were derived. So as to not keep you in suspense, this is what we found. Basically, 4.8% of the units indicated excessive clutter, and some at about 7.8. And what's interesting is, again, clutter is separate from poor sanitation in terms of our coding scheme, very similar rates in terms of none and some, and excessive as well. So this might then beg the question, are these the same people, those who are have indicated for clutter and those who have indicated for poor sanitation? And again, so as not to keep you in suspense, actually only 1.1% had both excessive clutter and excessive sanitation. And so, in fact, actually the 4.8 and 4.1, these are not exactly the same people. Actually, only a much smaller percentage are the same folks as well. We went on to then look at those who were flagged as having excessive clutter. So those units that were flagged as having excessive clutter, how did they compare in terms of the number of pest visits? And across the board, across all 4 developments, if the unit was flagged as having excessive clutter, they had a higher number of pest visits across all the different developments. And then we wanted to look a little bit further to understand the number of pest visits as well. And so if a unit was identified for excessive clutter and excessive poor sanitation, then it was estimated that they had 5.03 more pest visits than all other units. And if a unit was identified for no clutter or no poor sanitation, then it was estimated that they had 3.38 fewer pest visits. And that's the bar here, so the lower number as well. So that's kind of the relationship between, at least to give you kind of a brief sense of what some of that research was. We're starting to look, though, at adjacent units close by, both above and sharing walls, to kind of see how what tests kind of look like. Because of course the visits could be associated with a unit that had problems next door or above or below as well. So in phase 2, we did a very small pilot study that I'll mention very briefly for residents to reduce hoarding behaviors. Basically, the managers had flagged units independently. We had looked at the flagged units from the data, and we prioritized those units that were flagged by both the data and the managers. We basically chose 6 folks, several people from each of the development, a couple people from each of the development. You can see the demographics here in terms of who participated in this very small pilot. And in terms of eligibility, there was the clutter image rating that we'll be talking about. They were at least a level 4 to meet that eligibility, and we'll talk more about clutter image rating in a few moments. These are the components of the case management intervention, so including assessment, goal setting, working on motivational enhancement, and we'll talk about harm reduction. So some of what we'll be doing some hands-on kind of talking about more hands-on strategies kind of obviously come from this specific intervention. Organizing techniques, problem solving, actually engaging on hands-on sorting and decision making, and working on identifying additional resources and referrals. So there's a case manager who is hired by VHA who would go into the home and work with each individual. Each of these 6 individuals who had consented to agree to be part of the research study and to engage in this intervention. So of course this is a subgroup of folks who are willing to do that. This is the clutter image rating, and we're going to get into a lot more detail in a moment, but in a few minutes when we talk about assessment. But what you can see here is that increasingly greater clutter as you go from 1 to 9, and this happens to be a bedroom. And just to give you a sense of the research results, basically the white blue is the baseline, the initial rating, and then the post with the darker blue and green with follow-up. There is some gains over time, so our bars for most part are going down. And just a note at the bottom, so folks had a certain amount of time by which they can access this case manager, and so there is a range, as you see here, from 8 hours of contact to close to 32 hours of contact. So some people were willing to have a lot more contact with the case manager than others as well. Now, you might wonder, do these people actually have hoarding or not? And so we did include a measure that included, this is a 5-item measure that we use to assess hoarding symptoms specifically. And so each of the 5 items map onto some of the diagnostic criteria, so the clutter, difficulty discarding, collecting free things, or buying more than you would need or can use or afford, emotional distress and impairment. And so what we see here is that that folks had higher ratings of hoarding symptoms to start and above the typical kind of clinical cutoff. And then there was quite a nice reduction throughout. Now, what's interesting here is that, and what this shows is that clutter reductions sometimes move a little bit slower than than some of the other hoarding symptoms that were noted in terms of distress and impairment and difficulty discarding. So some people get relief in terms of difficulty discarding. Some people get relief with difficulty discarding. They were obviously able to address some of the clutter over time. The case manager who was working with training, both with myself and with Jesse, and with Dr. Christiana Bariotis, and so she was basically somebody who had a college degree and had weekly supervision as well. So in terms of some basic recommendations that came out of this, one was the hope that at some point maybe there will be some standardization of pest inspection forms, and that would include some indicators of hoarding behavior as well. We have obviously less control over this, but in terms of the LUI forms, BHA moved amazingly fast and actually changed their living unit inspection forms to include a clutter image rating on it. So there's a separate box for poor sanitation, a separate box for clutter, and using the CIR. And we started working on training folks at BHA. We've had a couple of meetings, most recently an all-day training, to kind of start that training process to address this issue. And obviously, this is an initial pilot. It was based on some of the interventions that Jesse is using in the field as well, and MBHC has its own report that you can avail yourself to online that looks a little bit at some of that data as well. So we're going to move on to some of the hands-on strategies that that we've used in some of our training. And basically just to kind of give you a gist of what's kind of coming. So we're going to talk a little bit about hoarding as a mental health problem that has, and its health and safety consequences. We're going to focus in on harm reduction as one technique that seems to be very, very helpful addressing hoarding. We'll practice using some of our hoarding-specific assessments today that you should have in your possession, both the clutter image rating and the home scale as well. So hopefully those are right there at your fingertips. And also talk through, a lot of times people are like, okay, I identified it, but now what do I do? Like, what are the other resources out there? So we'll point you in the direction of some partnerships and resources that hopefully will be helpful to you and that are nationally based as well. So this is one of my favorite pictures that Jesse has made, and this is the iceberg. And so at the tip of the iceberg, so to speak, is the clutter. It's what you see in front of you as a manifestation of hoarding. And it's what often people really, really focus in on. They focus on the stuff. But below the stuff, so to speak, and below the surface of the water, there's a lot of things that are going on to the actual person themselves. And we're going to kind of talk through very briefly what some of those aspects are. What are the components that are that result in the manifestation of a clutter, so to speak, above the surface that the world sees related to both. When we talk about hoarding, even though it was originally kind of people would really associate it with obsessive compulsive disorder, actually there's a larger group of people who don't have obsessive compulsive disorder but do have hoarding. So what you see here is that actually 50% of folks with hoarding also have major depressive disorder. So they're dealing with depression simultaneous to their hoarding. And about a quarter or so, 25% or so, have generalized anxiety disorder or social anxiety disorder. Many of you may work with folks and notice that they have inattention or attentional issues, and that's because about 27, 28% of folks have ADHD, so attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, and only actually about 17, 18% of folks reporting have OCD. Now, while a lot of folks who have hoarding or are suffering with hoarding speak about traumatic events in their life, a much smaller percentage actually have PTSD, so post-traumatic stress disorder. Many people who have had trauma in their life actually wind up suffering from depression. So let's with post-traumatic stress disorder. This is the cognitive behavioral model of treatment for hoarding specifically that was developed by Gail Steckity and Randy Frost. And this is basically, to me, this is when we saw the iceberg, this is kind of what's below the iceberg. So I'm going to just very briefly walk through various components of this model. The OCD treatments that have been used for a while wound up not having a favorable response to people with hoarding. Well, lo and behold, but that's not surprising considering how smaller percentage actually have OCD with hoarding. And so Dr. Steckity and Dr. Frost developed this model. And what this really does is starts to look at, if you look at the bottom of the model, it's the saving and acquiring and clutter behavior. So why is that happening? And so these are the components that contribute to the actual saving and acquiring and clutter. It's not causal though, and that's very important. So these are contributing, but we don't have a specific cause and effect kind of situation here. But our interventions do address each of these aspects or components that we do believe contribute to the saving, acquiring, and cluttering behavior. So the first box being the personal family vulnerability. So we already talked a little bit about the rates of other mental health problems that those with hoarding are also dealing with. So that's one vulnerability. But there's also obviously other physical health problems that come up, trauma, as I mentioned as well. A lot of folks also talk about grief and loss that they've experienced, some addiction, as well as family histories around hoarding. And that could either be potentially, we're doing research in terms of understanding genetic connections, but as Jesse earlier had noted, it could also be learning or not learning certain types of skills that can contribute, therefore, to some of these behaviors as well. You also may notice from folks that you work with who have hoarding is that they have information processing issues. So they have trouble making decisions. They struggle with issues around attention and again, or inattention. And again, 27, 28% of folks have actual ADHD. Folks have really hard time with problem solving and categorization. So folks with hoarding appreciate many more aspects of a specific item. So I look at a pencil and right away I think of, writing and using it as a pencil, but it has a certain shade in terms of color. It could have other utility as a plant filler or whatever. And so you appreciate many more aspects of an item, it becomes hard to basically categorize. And so categorization is a big issue, as well as decision making in terms of what categories to use with folks with hoarding. The next box is related to meaning of possessions. Now, the reasons that people with hoarding hold on to items are actually not that different than many of us hold on to items. I can't really ask you face to face right now, but if you think about why you hold on to some of your favorite items, most of those reasons, may be related to sentimental reasons. Somebody gave it to you, maybe it's useful, maybe you think that it represents a time in your life or a certain aspect of your identity. So, for example, you're someone who holds on to a lot of books because you think of yourself as somebody who reads a lot, or maybe hold on to items from a certain job that you've had at certain points in the hopes of either getting back to that or to kind of commemorate that period of one's life as well. Now, if you think about kind of reconnecting with items, so those of you who moved or you're kind of cleaning out your closet and so forth, when you see an item that you haven't seen in a while, very often there's that feeling of kind of being reunited with the item and then joy. There's a lot of positive emotions in terms of connecting with items. And that positive emotion, whether it be joy or relief because you've lost it at some point and you want to kind of, now you found it, or the fondness or pleasure of having that item, that becomes reinforcing to hold on to items over time. But then there's the negative piece of it, which is also, there's a bit of kind of grief and loss, anxiety, guilt around letting go of items. Maybe frustration, why should I let this go? It's mine, and so forth. And so that also gets reinforced when people hold on to an item. That sense of grief and loss can kind of go away as well. There's also avoidance of certain kinds of feelings as well, avoidance of decisions to make any decision at all, avoidance of, in terms of just attending to the clutter and actually spending the time managing it, avoidance of people coming into the home in terms of inviting folks into the home, avoidance of losing information, all kinds of avoidances as well that get reinforced over time as well, and that leads to more saving, acquiring, and of course more clutter, unless there's somebody else involved that is helping to manage that. So we do actually see hoarding behaviors even in people who don't have a very cluttered environment, even though we tend to again focus very much on the clutter. So what would make people motivated to change? So we really focus in on two aspects, both importance and confidence. And when we think about motivation, we also think about, are there ways of enhancing that motivation? People with hoarding may be ambivalent at best about addressing this problem. Motivational problems is a hallmark of hoarding. And so we want to know how important it is to that particular person to address this. Is there some angle that person really cares about? How does it relate to their particular values and so forth to address this problem? And what kind of skills does the person need to boost their confidence in terms of addressing the problem as well? So enhancers may include support people. This could include family members or not. It really depends on where that family member is at with the issue around hoarding, and also related to their own potential hoarding behavior as well. Other people who may be coaches that may come into the home, and we're going to talk a little bit more about specific types of home-based assistance as well. But we also always want to be thinking about other co-occurring mental health problems that may be slowing down the process and addressing the hoarding as well when we think about our intervention.
All right. So now that we've kind of talked about some of the things that are underlying the hoarding issue, let's turn our attention to the physical manifestation, or the way I like to think of it, one of the symptoms of hoarding, and that is the saving, the acquiring, the disorganization, and we're going to talk about how to assess those particular things. So some examples of saving are holding on to papers or photographs, or I have a client who holds on to church bulletins as part of his connection to his faith identity. We have the acquiring aspect. People can go in and hold on to junk mail or other kinds of possessions, newspaper articles, and other kinds of information. And then the last part is the clutter and the disorganization. That's the physical pieces that we see. Large stacks of paper or boxes, narrow egress paths then filled with various kinds of items. So these are all of the physical manifestations that we're going to talk about as we turn our attention to assessment. So the two assessment tools that we're going to use today are the clutter image rating and the home's multidisciplinary risk assessment. And these are tools that you can put into place very easily in your daily practice, regardless of your profession. So this is the clutter image rating, which was developed by Dr. Randy Frost, and we use this on a regular basis in our office to get a sense of how severe is the physical clutter in a home. To give you a sense, clinically, clutter starts at a 4 on this scale. Generally speaking, though, we see health and safety violations at a 5. Certainly, anywhere from a 4 up, we're going to start running into issues around pest control and getting these units properly exterminated. There are a few tricks to using this particular scale, and this particular scale, again, is simply focused on the physical manifestations, not any of the risk assessment that we might also want to think about. So when you're looking at the scale, you can see in level 1 that we don't have a lot of clutter. You can easily access the window. You can sit down on the couch and move around pretty freely. By the time we get to a 3, we're starting to need to move things from the couch to sit down. There are a few items that could be a trip hazard. And at 4 and 5, we're really starting to have some difficulty using this living room and the room itself for its intended purpose. So at a 5, we have a large pile of items on the couch, difficulty accessing that window. And in terms of reading this, you want to use the height of the living room table, the couch, the top and the bottom of the windowsill here, and the top and the bottom of the framed photo here above the couch as indicators of how high the clutter has gotten. By the time we get to a 6, as you can see, 6, 7, 8, and 9, we have great difficulty moving through the unit. There are high levels of fire hazards and so forth. So that's the clutter image rating scale.
For those of you who happen to have an iPhone or a tablet, you can actually download the TIR. It's a free app that we developed that you can put right on your phone, and it includes the living room, the kitchen, and the bedroom pictures as well, and actually captures. In other words, you can actually put the ratings right into it and email it to your file first if somebody else is needed as well.
As I mentioned, the other tool we're going to talk about today is the Home's Multidisciplinary Risk Assessment that was developed by Dr. Christiana Bradiotis. This is a great tool for anyone who's coming into contact with the problem of hoarding. The front page of the tool has a list of various risk factors that are often associated with hoarding. You can see, if you pull up the Home tool, under Health, we have things like cannot use the bathtub or the shower, cannot access the toilet, can't prepare food or sleep in the bed, cannot use the stove, fridge, or sink, the presence of spoiled food. So here we get some information about not only the level of clutter, but some indicators for squalor as well, presence of insects, rodents, other kinds of infestation, as well as the presence of mold or chronic dampness. There's a notes field here that's really useful. There are times where residents may be able to sleep in their bed, but it's with great difficulty because they have to move items off of the bed, or a similar situation with the counters in the kitchen. And so this is a place where you can provide additional information that others can use when carrying out the intervention process. The obstacles piece, cannot move freely and safely in the home, the inability for firefighters or EMTs to get into the home and do their jobs with equipment. Unstable piles and avalanche risk. We've certainly heard of seen news accounts of people who are killed by items that are collapsing onto them from the large piles. And then concerns around egress, exits that are blocked either fully or just a very narrow egress path, vents that are blocked or unusable. And again, there's a notes field there. Mental health. This is important. We're not asking someone to make a diagnosis here. This is simply an area where you can raise some awareness if the resident seems overly defensive and angry, a little more anxious than you're accustomed to. They may not understand the seriousness of the problem, or they may not be likely to accept the consequences of the problem, because that'll change a little bit how someone engages with the resident in the home during the intervention process to try and build that insight and motivation. The assessment piece is very straightforward for the engagement category. Is there a threat to a child, an elder, a person with a disability, an animal, or is there a threat to a neighbor with a common wall? As Jordana mentioned earlier, if you're in a high-density environment here in Boston, and many of you may share that as well. And so the risk when we have someone that's in a large multifamily building is very different than if we have someone who's in a single-family home that's on multiple acres of land. And so that's certainly something we have to take into account during these kinds of assessments. Structure and safety. This is something we often see in owner-occupied housing, particularly. This looks at unstable floorboards, stairs, porches. Certainly there have been situations where I've walked onto a three-family porch and felt it pull away from the home, partially because it is perhaps not in good structural condition, but a lot of it also has to do with the weight of the accumulated possessions on some of these structures. Flammable items besides heat sources, that could be items on top of the stove or in the oven, or it could be things like piles of paper or clothing up against the furnace, on top of vents, and those types of things. Storage of hazardous materials. Some examples that we've seen are 3-liter bottles of gasoline on a gentleman's basement floor, hypodermic needles that have been used, all of these kinds of things. Leaking roofs, caving walls, concerns around electrical cords, no heat or running water. We often will see these when an owner has been afraid to call someone in to make repairs because they're concerned that inspectional services or public health would be called in response to their concerns. And then blocked or unsafe electric heaters or vents. The back side of the home tool shows how many adults and kids are in the home, how many and what kind of pets, so we can understand is there an animal hoarding situation or the impact on animals in the hoarded home. Does the person have a physical disability that we're aware of? Because at times that can mean we need to bring some additional resources in for the intervention process. And then what are some of the risk measures? Is there a threat of self-harm, harm to family members or others in the public? We certainly are aware of times where individuals and families have undergone interventions and cleanouts and then have come back and committed suicide because the impact of having all of their possessions lost was too great. So we want to be able to plan for some of that and collaborate with our mental health colleagues around those situations. Is there an imminent threat of eviction or condemnation, which that certainly speeds up some of the time frames potentially? And then what is working in favor of the residents? Are they aware of the clutter? Are they willing to acknowledge the health and safety risks in order to remain in that home? Are they physically able to clear the clutter? Are they psychologically able to tolerate the intervention? And then are they willing to engage with someone, even at a minimal level, to talk about how to address the hoarding problem and keep themselves safe in their home? All right, so let's practice. And Susanna, I'm going to ask you to bring the poll up for the clutter image rating. Here is the clutter image rating. Please take a moment to look at this very closely. And I'm going to pull up. All right, so it's opened the poll. So here's the clutter image rating. Again, the problem of hoarding starts clinically at a 4. So I'm going to show a photo now. And I want you to rate it on this poll. All right, so here's the first photo. So poll question number 1. Take a look at this photo and rate it using your clutter image rating on a scale of 1 to 9. All right, so I'm going to show you a second photo. If you go down to question 2 of the poll and do the same thing. Here's the clutter image rating again. Take a good look. And here's the photo, the bedroom photo, just to give you a sense of height of the pile. They're about 3.5 or 4 feet high throughout the entire room. And now I'm going to show the clutter image rating again. And then here's another photo. This is a kitchen environment. It's a panoramic photo. The height of the piles varies, as you can see, greatly. On the left side here, the height of that pile runs about 6 or 6.5 feet high. You can see in the middle of the room here, we have some level of reduction in the height of the pile to something along the lines of 5 feet high. And then on the right side here, you can see the pile increases. This is the density of the pile stretches equally all the way back to the windows here, so it is quite dense. So you can answer on this poll that is open, question number 3, using this photo. All right, I'm going to give you just a few more seconds, and then we're going to close the poll. So give you about 30 seconds more, and then we're going to talk through the photos that you're seeing so you can get a better understanding of how we are rating these. All right, I'm going to flip back to the clutter image rating again. Give you just 2 or 3 more seconds. All right, the poll is closed. All right, so it looks like for this first photo, vast majority of you rated this as a 3, which I think is a good answer. I would rate it between a 2 and a 3 here. So clearly we don't have a hoarding problem here. Definitely something perhaps we're going to monitor with the height of the books. That could be potentially a risk, but not a hoarding problem. If we look, though, at the photo of that bedroom that we discussed, a number of you rated it as a 6 or a 7. A large percentage of you were not sure of the answer. And so I would have rated this a 7 based on the height and the density of this apartment. Master Dan would also rate it as well.
Yeah, I would say about a 6.5, 7 as well.
And then this last photo here, question number 3 on the poll, that kitchen area, the majority of you rated it as an 8 or a 9. I certainly would have given it an 8 based on the height of the pile and the density of the piles as well.
Absolutely, I agree. It's an 8. Not quite a 9 because there's still quite a bit of space above.
So let's talk a little bit about some of the common code violations. Blocked egress, fire load, which is simply the volume of combustible solids in a home, fire hazards like items on top of a stove or near a heat source, trip hazards, which I mentioned earlier, crush hazards, infestation. The plumbing not functioning is a big one. If you have a 2-bathroom home, for example, and 1 bathroom is functional and 1 is not, you can still have problems because in the bathroom where water is not the sinks aren't being used and the water's not running through the traps, you can have sewer gas building up and causing all kinds of problems for families. Sanitation concerns, which we've talked about, and then that structural safety element as well. So let's turn our attention to harm reduction. So the goal of harm reduction is to keep people safe in their homes. We really want to focus on reduction of the volume of possessions in high-risk areas first. We want to make sure that we're setting up systems during the intervention process to minimize the amount of new items that are coming in and maintain some organization or develop some organizational systems in the homes that we're working in. Oftentimes what we see is that residents do have some sort of organizational system that they're trying to implement, so it's often a good idea to build off of that. We want to make sure that we're not expecting overnight miracles, and we're not going to go from heavily hoarded homes having a Better Homes and Gardens or Martha Stewart's home, and so we want to really make sure we're not setting our clients up and ourselves up for failure in terms of our expectations, and a large part of this work really is managing our expectations during the intervention process. Talk a little bit about some of the tricks and strategies for harm reduction. One of the things that we often see is that residents are having a difficult time maintaining an egress path of 36 to 38 inches, depending on the code in your location. One of the things that we will do, particularly when there's a higher clutter image rating, is we'll clear out an egress path and then put down blue painter's tape from a variety of different home hardware stores. And we can use that path the tape as a visual indicator for the area for that egress path to remain clear. And we find that our clients actually respond very well to using that kind of strategy. We've also done a similar thing when piles have been higher than 3 or 4 feet and we're working to reduce the volume of height on that pile. And so we'll use some orange construction string or some blue painter's tape around the edge of the room to show how high piles can be, and then work with the residents to reduce the volume of clutter so it stays below the height of that string or painter's tape that we're using as a visual cue. I had a client that we worked with who had dementia and had a number of fires in her home. Over the course of 6 weeks, she had 4 fires in her home. one of the things that we did with her is that we cleared the stove area and cleared the counter on either side of that stove. So there's about 18 inches of clear space there so items weren't sliding down onto the stovetop. And we put down bright pink tape there. She likes color pink. And we put a vase of flowers over that as, again, another visual indicator so that she was able to keep that area clear, and she actually had no more fires after that. So there are some harm reduction strategies that you can use that are very simple, very practical strategies as you're trying to reduce some of the safety risks in these homes. And now Jordana's going to talk about I'm good. Okay. Sorry about that. So let's talk a little bit about the intervention options. The best case scenario is if you are equipped in your community to have someone who can do supportive step-by-step clutter reduction. And that's going to be both in the short term and in the long term your best case scenario. So that could be a case manager who's been trained to do sorting and discarding work. In-home behavioral coaches, we've worked with clergy members to teach volunteers from their churches how to do sorting and discarding. We've used undergraduate students from local universities. So it doesn't have to be someone who's a trained professional. You can have a lot of different options for developing people who can do this in-home work. Mental health treatment is another way to access supportive step-by-step reduction in clutter, and then using some of those harm reduction strategies that we talked about just a few moments ago. If you don't have that as an option, or if there's an indication from an enforcement party that they're not willing to engage in that step-by-step reduction in clutter, doing what we would call a supported clean-out is another option. This is a scenario where the client would determine what items were going to stay in the home and what items could be removed, so they have full control over that, but you're bringing in a team of people to reduce the volume of clutter over a series of days, so it's a much more quick reduction in clutter. If you do need to do that, if there is a way to put some of the mental health treatment or case management in place at a later date, that'll go a long way to preventing recidivism in terms of clutter building back up again. One of the things that people need to do is help clients build the skill set they need to maintain clutter moving forward. So addressing some of the executive function issues that Jordana mentioned just a few moments ago, learning how to set some limits around how much they can hold on to, all of those types of things. And then we have the clean out without control of the unit. This is really not going to be long-term and effective option. Certainly we see it. These are expensive options. We're looking at, tens of thousands of dollars potentially. And this is where you go in, you bring a dumpster, the resident is off-site, and everything from the home gets thrown away. And what we find in this is that certainly it's a way to very quickly reduce the volume of clutter and address the health and safety options. But very often what we see is that the clutter returns very quickly. The resident is less inclined to work with someone in terms of a long-term intervention. And the resident isn't able to develop the skill set that they need. Really, when you're doing a clean-out, going back to that iceberg, you're just cutting off the tip of the iceberg, and we're not addressing any of the other aspects of the hoarding problem. And so that's why you're likely to not see long-term results with a clean-out approach. And then we have eviction and condemnation, which certainly we've seen a lot of evidence that doing supportive case management or using some mental health treatment and, if necessary, doing a supportive clean-out can help to avoid very effectively, even in a 7, 8, or a 9 on that clutter image rating, we can do a lot to prevent eviction and condemnation in these types of hoarding cases. Here are some of the factors to consider when you're thinking about what intervention option to choose. Certainly you want to look first at the level of risk to the resident and others in that building or surrounding building. You want to look at any information you have about physical or mental health disability. 75% of the folks that we work with have some sort of physical or mental health disability and are able to effectively engage with our program. But certainly you want to weigh a variety of different concerns around that when you're looking at the intervention options. You want to look at your supportive services available in your community, both in-home services and services where the resident would travel out of the home to access those services. The willingness of the resident to engage with support services. Certainly one of the things that in mental health treatment or in a case management approach you would do is to build the insight and motivation of a client. So even if someone is resistant in the beginning, there often work can be done to build their willingness to engage over time with supportive services. And then you want to look at any potential capacity issues. We often make referrals to elder services when we're concerned about how well an elder is engaging with our program, or when we're concerned about child protective services and those kinds of things. So these are the issues you want to weigh as you're choosing an intervention strategy.
So just to kind of give you a brief idea of what the in-home sorting kind of looks like. This is a system, the Keep Discard I Don't Know system, that was developed by Gail Stephanie and Randy Frost, and we have tested through various types of research. So I know that there's a whole bunch of different ways that people recommend, but this system is specifically supported by research findings as well. And so there's the keep pile for folks that when they're in the midst of sorting, that they do plan to hold on to, the discard pile that they plan to let go of, and then the I don't know pile, which is just a temporary situation. So if everything, of course, is going in from the big pile into the I don't know pile, we kind of cut that off quickly. But this is supposed to be temporary so that the person keeps the momentum when they're sorting, and that certain decisions that might be harder and much harder can be made towards the end of the sorting session, but making sure that enough time is left for that. Now, the first decision is to keep the discard piece of it, and then after the keep and discard piles are made during a specific sorting session, and we typically recommend no more than up to 2 hours because most people get much more fatigued at less time than that, so it really depends on the person, but certainly more than 2 hours winds up being way too much for most of the folks that we work with. When they decide on keep, the idea is for folks to also use to identify specific categories and a final location. Now, the final destination is often blocked, and so we use boxes and so forth to actually label, a specific area. So, in other words, using a box, for example, that says bedroom 1, and then those items that the person is keeping that will eventually go into the bedroom 1 closet goes into that particular box and is labeled accordingly, and move the box as close to that location as possible. For the discard, we actually, after the person already makes the decision to discard a pile of items, at that point, then they subcategorize into whether they're going to recycle, sell, give away, donate, and so forth. I like to have a trash right there that's already there, so the person makes a decision to trash it, it's done, we're done with it. But if they're going to discard and want to do it another way, often we need to talk through whether what's really possible in terms of that and how much time it's going to take and resources given whatever timetable that the person is working with at the time. And also to get a sense of, so for example, if one of my clients wanted to sell something, what do they believe is the market rate comparatively to what is actually out there? So how are they valuing the item versus the market value as well? What I like to do is tag with a specific date by which the person is going to be selling or giving it away, and then that date passes and it goes into the trash. That way that we don't have to kind of keep going through that pile as well. And it's critical that the person actually literally, if it's going to the trash or going out for recycle, that we always check in, because very often people do make the decision, but the hardest part is when they're actually letting go, and that's where that system kind of breaks down. So always checking in as to whether the items did truly move out of the home location. So in the decluttering session, these are briefly some of the steps. It can be very, very overwhelming for folks to look at their whole area and decide where to start, partly because of potential issues, partly it's just so overstimulating for folks. So in selecting a target area, of course, really focusing on safety and health first. Sometimes it's not as much as Jesse was saying about getting the stuff out, it's moving the stuff from one spot to another. And then also what types of possessions. So sometimes people will start in a specific area that there's a health and safety issue, or that they might start with a certain type of possession that may be particular problematic to them. Paper, and a certain newspaper in a certain area, for example. as well. As I mentioned, creating specific categories and helping folks and making sure whatever categorical system is intuitive to them. Again, as I mentioned earlier, folks with hoarding appreciate many more aspects of an item than others, and so that helping with that categorization system. Continuing to obviously work on decluttering until the target area is clear, and understanding that clear area, while for some of us might be very reinforcing, that's great, that's a indication of success. For other people that with hoarding, that's very, very triggering in terms of having that open space, and that can be very difficult and bring up other mental health issues as well. So in order to assist with that, one of the strategies for keeping that area clear, as Jesse mentioned, using tape and kind of keeping it so that part of it is maintaining that area, but also what other use might the person have for that particular area, so it's being used and not just kind of a barren land, so to speak, sitting there as well. And also thinking through how to prevent new clutter to that area by restricting it to some extent and having the person use it and hopefully enjoy it in a new way. Again, relating it and anchoring it back in their original goals and values and things that they care a lot about to reinforce that behavior over time. So none of us can really do this alone. A team is critical. That's how we've all gotten to know each other and work so closely over time together. And so we mentioned earlier in terms of in-home coach, it would be great to get folks in a home. And as I mentioned, there's, and listed here, there's a number of people who could serve potentially as a coach, family, friends, home health aides, students, hired assistants, and so forth. But these are some of the most important aspects of doing coaching work. Providing emotional support and encouragement, helping folks identify the areas to work, but really talking with folks and collaborating as opposed to making decisions for the person. Often a lot of folks with hoarding say that just having somebody present makes all the difference in helping them focus on a specific task as well. And so the presence of having someone there is a big piece of it. It's okay to guide decisions, but again, not make them for it. And be encouraging as as somebody who's cheering the person along the way. Some folks are basically the muscle, so they wind up helping to haul stuff or move stuff as needed as well. And we also like to practice non-acquiring. In other words, going places and being able to tolerate the anxiety and so forth of not actually buying things when people are out. And we all know that you can acquire passively in all kinds of ways. In other words, passive acquiring, meaning like stuff that comes in through the mail and so forth. There's stuff out on the corners all the time. So there's a lot of stuff out there that people could acquire without buying. So practicing that piece is an important part, and celebrating the successes, no matter how small. So this really means not giving into judgment and remaining objective. And this is both verbal and in terms of gesture. So many of us have expressive faces and need to kind of keep that in mind in terms of being in a hoarded environment as well. And being very careful not to touch items unless somebody states that that's okay. It's amazing. It takes a lot of time to develop a relationship with someone with hoarding potentially, and there's nothing that could dent that relationship quicker than starting to touch items that the person did not give permission to do so. So very important to be thinking about touching, or not touching, should I say.
So in terms of using a team-based approach, using a carrot and stick approach is great. One of the things that we know is that you can't wear both hats successfully and say, you have to get rid of your most prized possessions, and here, let me support you in doing that. And so as a housing professional that works for an organization, we have several thousand Section 8 vouchers. I partner often with Jordana and other clinical folks in that work. We use a coordinated service plan that clearly outrolls roles and responsibilities of all of the agencies and the residents. That ensures we have clear communication. We use a lot of the email and things like that. We want to make sure that we have a contingency plan for, if something falls through, if a service provider falls through, or if the resident isn't able to follow through, what is the backup housing plan for them? Or if there's pest control work that needs to be done and they're struggling with that, what's the backup plan to make sure that work gets done? And then one of the things that we found is it's really important to figure out who on that intervention team is responsible for making sure the unit has met compliance, or saying when the unit has met compliance, I should say. And then there needs to be someone who coordinates communication and the services. And that just really helps streamline things across the board. A big part of the team-based approach is all of us wear many hats in our agency, particularly those of us in public housing and who work with subsidized housing providers. And so there are public housing providers out there who do this kind of work and do some sorting and discarding and has resident service coordinators and case managers in there. And that's really critical, both from a resident tenancy preservation perspective, but also fiscally. There's some evidence that we're seeing in our program that this may be a cheaper way to go about keeping people stably housed. And so it can be done, but it really takes sharing the work and everyone taking a small piece of the pie in order to be successful. Elements of an effective plan, specifying what the infractions are, the code violations are, making sure that there's some measurable objectives that are out there, making sure there's a clear timeline that everyone is aware of, identifying resources for assistance, whether it's trash removal, who's going to pay for it and how, or if it's a case manager who's going to make the referral, determine on a regular basis how progress is going. We have reached those objectives. I find a monthly inspection to be often enough to maintain some level of pressure and see change without it being overwhelming for the resident. Looking at creating some common goals with the resident. Oftentimes we think that housing stability may be the thing that keeps them engaged when in fact they're worried about being able to have a grandchild over or have friends over for tea. Utilizing that carrot and stick approach, and then supportive monitoring after the compliance point has been reached, we found has helped prevent some recidivism, so that someone's still checking in with people every 3 or 4 months just for a few minutes to make sure the clutter isn't coming back in. It helps reinforce the skills that people are learning as part of the intervention process as well. And they're really holding out this clean out, eviction, and condemnation as the last option when you've tried all of the other supportive approaches that we've discussed today. There are task forces around the country now. There's more than 100 of them. Many of those focus on education of the community and professionals in the community. Some of them share cases and coordinate that assistance, and some of them do both. This is what our colleague, Dr. Brenda Yotis, does best in her work. She's absolutely outstanding at helping create these task forces. They're in urban communities and in rural communities all over the United States, and really they're an outgrowth of cases that have gone badly and communities who want to have a better approach. When you're looking at task force development, here's a variety of different membership possibilities, and not all task forces have these, but you want some mix. So housing professionals, public health, mental health, first responders, code enforcement, nursing, whether it's clinical practice or in the home. So this is a wide variety of folks that you can have if you're looking at forming a task force or strengthening a task force that you may also be involved in.
There's a number of resources, and I believe there's a resource sheet also that is available to you as well. I don't see it here, but anyway, hopefully that we'll be able to make that available if it's not currently. For you to see in various parts of the country. However, these are just 3 to note. One is the International OCD Foundation. On their website, there's actually a virtual hoarding center that gives information, various kinds of assessments, as well as resources in terms of mental health providers that have specific training around hoarding, and other different types of providers as well. Professional organizers, other folks as well who can be in the home. Some of you may actually be on these lists as well. Mass Housing has an outstanding website that has a whole host of information as well that I highly encourage you to take a look at, not only in terms of assessments, but there's actually like specific plans that are on there. There's code enforcement information. There's a list of all the task forces around the country that is updated regularly. So a number of things that I think are very, very, very relevant to those of you who are in housing as well. And then Metropolitan Boston Housing Partnership has their own website with a number of great resources as well. In addition to their report, they just finished up a outstanding grant and they have a whole report on looking at the effectiveness of their case management intervention model that is starting to be disseminated with some replication sites as well.
One of the things just to be thinking about as you kind of move forward with your thoughts on hoarding intervention and developing systems, education is key in doing this work. If you have a well-educated staff and you build a system, whether it's a task force or other intervention, case management and these intervention methods can be very cost-effective as a response. We did some analysis in our program as part of the report that Jordana mentioned, and we found that on average for long-term case management, and we followed people for 3 years, we were spending $1,800 as our agency cost on these cases, and that's compared to the average of $10,000 for an eviction in Greater Boston and $15,000 or $20,000 for cleanout. So this is a much more fiscally effective response. And in terms of clutter image rating, we were seeing people go down into the twos in terms of the drop in clutter image rating and staying that way for 2 to 3 years of the data that we have. We hope to follow those folks longer to get 3 and 5 year data, but certainly there's a lot of evidence to show that this is effective.
Mm-hmm. So we're going to wrap up here. Here's some of our contact information, and we are also hoping to take a few questions before we wrap up today. Susanna?
I've been collecting questions in the chat box, and if we don't get to your question, we'll post them with the little Q&A section on our website. I think a lot of these that came in you covered. One question was, what was the professional background of the intervention staff? And I think you covered that. You said it didn't have to be somebody with a mental health background, but clergy, undergrads, social workers. Any other thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, the folks that we've had, and like I said, some of them had college degrees, some didn't, some are, very well trained, some not. I think what's important is that there is some kind of training over time and some oversight from someone who does have some training. Training is, as we said earlier, in terms of education, a very, very important piece, and to have a support team of some sort. And that team could be one person, but one other person as well.
And somebody asked, were the buildings studied single occupancy units?
It was a range of buildings that we chose, so that there was a range both in building type and in the type of families that lived there. So there were elderly buildings that were studios and 1-bedrooms, but we also had family developments, and those had 2, 3, 4, and 5 bedroom units. So there was a real range.
Thanks. Another person brought up the pest management aspects of the implications for pest management, and what is the pest management professional up against, and how does this impact their job? Has it improved? Has it helped? Have you had pest management professionals have challenges? What's the impact there?
Well, at a few different levels, it has a big impact. So we're dealing with a multi-family housing situation, and if one home that is filled with clutter has a pest issue, and you're going in as the pest contractor to try to deal with that, one of the first things you're trying to do is to do an effective inspection. But if you've got 2, 3, 4, 5 feet of stuff all around the apartment, you're going to have a very hard time doing a quality, thorough inspection. And then there's a problem in terms of treatment. Even if you know that you have a particular type of pest and that you're trying to treat it, it can have big impact on your neighbors upstairs, downstairs, and so that is part of our inspection protocol, that we're going to be looking at the surrounding units to see if there's been an expansion that those pests are getting through the walls and the cracks and crevices and are affecting their neighbors as well. But so it has a pretty huge impact both in terms of the inspection and in terms of your treatment options. I'm thinking particularly right now of a case of a very cluttered unit with bed bugs. And so, where traditional spraying might not have been an option because you just couldn't you couldn't identify where the bugs were. So we may, in that case, have adopted our treatment and chosen a heat treatment where you're bringing the apartment temperature up to a certain to the kill rate. But it's expensive. It's not something that that's not our regular standard of treatment. So we have to adapt it depending on the situation.
Thanks. And one more time, what is the TIR app name for the iPhone?
It's the Clutter image rating.
Okay, so you just search for Clutter image rating. A couple people were curious about an Android app. But that's probably beyond what you guys can do.
Well, we're hoping. We got a small grant, and given that grant, had to go with Apple first. Even I definitely recognize that it's a limitation. So we're trying to get another grant and be able to do it on Android as well. So we'll keep you posted.
There's a few more questions that I think we'll save for the website, and we'll post the Q&As once we get the recording of the webinar up on the website. Kevin Judd just posted the Clutter image rating app link in the chat box. There was another question about bed bugs. Are bed bugs a frequent issue with hoarding properties? And I can say for sure it makes treatment a lot harder, but it doesn't cause bed bugs. They have to be introduced. And stay tuned. I will send a email out to all attendees when we have the webinar and the Q&A posted on our website. So thank you very much to our speakers, and it's just about 1:30, so we'll close out here. And when you close your meeting, you should get a website that pops up to do a little evaluation for us. Thank you so much, and thanks to Dr. Muroff, John Kane, and Jesse Edsel-Vetter. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for all of your time. Thank you.